Right. So we'll begin. So the start really, I think, for thinking about VSM, viable system model, is the sort of basic question of why model organisations, because most management disciplines don't build models particularly well. And for me that goes back to Conant-Ashby theorem, which is one of the cornerstones of management science. Every good regulator of a system has to be a model of that system, which translated into kind of plain English is our ability to manage an organisation or a situation or a problem depends on how well we understand it, and that depends on how good our models are, how appropriate and useful they are. So using VSM, which is a kind of normative model of what any organisation needs to be viable, what we find is faults of commission, so things the organisation's doing that it didn't ought to be doing, and many more faults of omission, so things that the organisation is not doing that it needs to be doing in order to be viable. So this is still the dominant model that people use to understand organisations. The hierarchical model. Ben and I have debates about the origins. We don't actually argue about the origins of this. We just argue about I think we argue about the aesthetics of it, don't we, Ben?
The meaning of it.
Okay. So for those kind of not familiar with the story, first came in as a graphical model in the middle of the 19th century following a train crash in the US, and they gave the job of working out whose fault it was to the guy who designed the switching system, and he used the same kind of iconography as he'd used for designing the switching system to model the organisation. So he modelled the organisation as a series of switch points where particular people took particular decisions. So it's really, really good for the things it's designed for, which is modelling power, responsibility and blame, and not quite so good for some stuff that I would say was quite fundamental, like what the organisation does and how it does it and the processes and structures and that sort of thing. So the colourful bag of knitting on the left hand side is VSM, the thing that we all know and love, or some of us know and love. And when Stafford Beer first designed this, what he was after is the same thing as the complexity guys are chasing now, which is a science of organisation, a set of invariant rules that would apply to any type of organisation. And his first book on this, Brain of the Firm, became a standard teaching text in British medical schools on how the human nervous system worked, so which is slightly surreal. But it was the best thing that they had on the working of the human nervous system rather than the pure physiology of it. So there's a lot of stuff in it. So we present it as a graphical model, but actually it represents a set of complexity equations. So what it's looking at fundamentally is how the organisation deals with complexity. And it models structures and processes and how the organisation takes decisions and communication flows and information and how it manages performance and change. So there's a lot packed into it, and it looks horribly complex, but actually it's dead simple. The reason it looks complex is because it has a recursive or fractal structure, which is one of the ways it deals with complexity. So if we look at how that's built up, and we start with primary activities, so the things, these are represented in this model as circles, as normal speak, operations. And these are things that deliver some sort of value into the external environment. So what we're doing is separating out primary activities, system one in Stafford Beer speak, the things that the organisation does that provide value to external customers, from everything else that it needs to do to keep itself in being. So we're sitting in BT, and providing broadband is primary for BT. Doing its own accounts is essential but is not primary. So that is a support and regulatory activity. So understanding what is primary and what is not is really a question about purpose and identity. Yeah. And then we can take those primary activities and look at how they're structured in the organisation. So either how working from the top, from the overall purpose of the organisation and how that's decomposed into sub-activities that deliver that, or if you take a set of disparate activities, how those can be structured up. So I was doing some work last week with the Ministry of Agriculture looking at the agricultural sector, which slightly scarily they did not know to an order of magnitude how many farmers they had, but they did know that the farmers were not in any way organised, and there were a lot of them. So one of their big concerns, in fact the biggest concern, the thing that they could not, without which they couldn't do anything, was really to get the farmers organised. And there are different ways you can do that. You can do it by geography, you can do it by crop type, you can do it by, yeah. So in that sort of situation, you're starting off with a lot of activities and saying, how can we structure those up to make it more structured and more coherent? So you can look at this as a decomposition, you can look at it as a building up of order. And the way that's done in organisations is according to different types of complexity that the system deals with. So you can either split the complexity by task, so split it by doing different things, or by customer, so doing things for different customers, or by geography, or by time. So if you think about the police force in England, that is split at the top level by geography. So we have regional police forces, and then at the next level it's split by task. So we have traffic, you have the drug squad, you have fraud, you have CID, whatever. And then at the next level it's split by either geography again, so you have beat police who patrol a particular area of their patch, or by time, by shift. Yeah. Now if you reorder that, you get a completely different result. So did some work in Scotland for a local authority, and in Scotland the police are not split by geography at the top level, they're split by task. So you have in Scotland you have a national police force that does national policing of traffic, drugs, fraud, whatever, and the result's completely different, particularly for the local authority who go, who's our partner on community policing? And there isn't one, because there is no coherent police at that level. So this has a huge effect. When you're doing structural stuff, this has a huge effect on what the organisation's good at and what it's bad at. And in a design context, this is probably the single biggest design decision you take. So we put up productivity in a factory by 40% within a week just by changing this. Not the people, not the kit, not the physical layout, just organising them differently. And you get a completely different result. So we now have 3 of today's speakers here, but not the first, so that's only a little bit worrying, but I'm sure it'll pass. So then we look at the aspects of the system that are to do with actually gluing it back together into a coherent system. And the first of these is coordination, so system 2 in Stafford's language. And this is mechanisms that allow primary activities to do their thing without screwing things up for one another. And it tends to be quite sort of passive things, so protocols, schedules, common standards, common languages, that sort of thing. And if you think about the timetable in a school, the timetable is just a piece of paper, but it's the miracle of organisation that ends up, that ensures that 1,500 kids and 200 teachers end up in the right room at the right time in order to get through the syllabus, so that at the end of 2 years all the kids can go and do their exams and have covered the whole sort of syllabus that it's supposed to cover. Now if you think about trying to organise that in any other way, it would be an absolute shambles. You know, if on a Monday morning like this the head teacher stood at the front and said, Steve, could you take 30 of the second years and do what is it you teach again, mate? You know, with 1,000 or 1,500 kids, it would be absolute mayhem. And all that is achieved by the miracle of planning that is the school timetable. And everybody kind of takes it for granted, except the poor schmuck who has to spend his summer holidays working it out and going hairless in the process. So where this breaks down, you get a fairly classic set of symptoms, and this breaks down in most organisations. So most organisations massively underestimate the importance of coordination and the cost of it. So we tend to promote people for firefighting, and coordination is about fire prevention really. So where it breaks down, conflicts over resource, turf wars, so two departments fighting over who's going to get to do what, conflicting messages to customers because one department will say you can have it next week and another one says no, it's not going to start till next month. And where those spats happen, the start of the systemic failure, if you like, that you get higher levels of management dragged down to sort out the spats. Any of this familiar? Yeah. Very, 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 very common in organisations. So I said that the circles are primary, they're operations in this model, and the boxes are about management. And the first bit of this is about, stuff I've done in red, is about ensuring that the beast delivers, that the organisation actually performs and delivers what it's supposed to deliver in terms of delivering value to the external environment. And the first thing in this really is about being specific, which VSM allows you to do. It's quite difficult in VSM to do what people do mostly, which is fudge the connection between activities, operational activities, and decisions about that. So normally if you go into an organisation and you ask them about, for example, performance metrics, they say, oh yeah, we've got these metrics. And you've got no idea, and it's almost impossible to find out what they are metrics about. So what is actually being measured and that we're going to take any notice of. Yeah. So this is about a relationship on agreeing performance from one level to another. So imagine we've got a department here and in it two teams, each with the team management. This is about the relationship of what we need each of those teams to deliver in terms of performance, agreeing that or not, agreeing how we're going to measure that performance, and then a reciprocal relationship about resource. So the basic spinal relationship in VSM is this one of, if I give you this level of resource, can you deliver that level of performance, Rob? Yes or no? And it's obviously no, so we renegotiate. One of the many things that goes wrong with this is fragmentation. So we end up having separate conversations about resource and performance. So I have one conversation about performance with Rob and a different one about resource with Steve, and it's in Rob's interest to screw me on performance and it's in Steve's interest to screw me on resource, and I end up squeezed in the middle, which is the fastest way to break individuals or teams and a almost sort of guarantee of failure. And again, this is incredibly common in organisations. We had a client who structurally split this, not just in terms of their completely different departments, which don't talk to one another, but they were also asynchronous, so they were 6 months apart. So the idea that you could join this together in a conversational loop of this performance, this resource for this performance, was physically impossible. Yeah. And that's just a recipe for failure. I mean, this is not rocket science to say if you don't get the resource, you ain't going to get the performance. It's not that hard, is it really? So in Stafford's terminology, this is system 3. And one of the things that goes wrong here, apart from the fragmentation, is the control dilemma. So something happens in the environment to change demand, and the operation guys react. Management panics at the lack of control, so they perceive that something has shifted and they don't know quite what it is. The natural reaction then is to demand more and more reporting on the operations. So the operation guys then get hit by demands from senior managers, and they spend half the time fighting them off at the other half the time trying to sort out the operational issues. So you get a failure at that level. You get a failure at the next level because the senior guys are now no longer doing their strategic job. They're trying to micromanage something that by definition they do not understand. Yeah. This familiar? You're smiling, David, so I'm guessing it is in your world of project management. Yeah?
Very much so, very much so.
And again, this is incredibly common. I've never been in an organisation in 20 odd years where you can't see this happening. Yeah. And the way out of it is system 3-star, the monitoring loop. So this goes down from what, sorry, I'm losing my voice, which is probably no bad thing really, isn't it, in the great scheme of things, which goes down from one level of management, bypasses the next level of management and looks at what is actually happening on the ground. So whereas performance reporting tends to be quantitative, this is qualitative generally. So this is in-depth, sporadic, understanding what is actually going on. Yeah. Very little understood. I don't know much in the management literature that talks about this. If you go back a couple of hundred years, this was a standard. And if you look at sort of TV programs of Back to the Floor, where managers sort of pretend to be shop floor staff, they're always deeply shocked at what they discover being there. So the VSM structure really about ensuring that the system actually performs is really quite straightforward. You've got a relationship between different levels about agreeing and measuring performance. You've got a reciprocal relationship about agreeing resources, which has to be run as a conversational loop, otherwise the thing breaks. And monitoring to check it works. So far so simple. Then we've got a completely different aspect of management. Stuff in blue, system 4 in Stafford speak, which is about looking outside and into the future. So this is surveying, technical, competitive market developments, doing R&D, creating the future, planning, all that sort of stuff. Again, massively underrepresented in organisations, so you see huge imbalances in organisations' ability and willingness to commit resource to doing this. So there's a guy who comes to SIO occasionally who was a consultant in a 40,000 person consultancy, and he went along to the technical director. I mean, if you think consultancy is a kind of a knowledge intensive industry, you'd think they'd be interested in building the knowledge because it's like the currency that you spend, you know. So he went along to the technical director and said, we really ought to be investing in new technique, next practice. And the tech director said, yep, you're absolutely right, Richard, we really should. And out of 40,000 consultants, they couldn't find a way to pay for one person to do R&D. And that's how out of balance this gets in organisations. So where it breaks down, classic set of symptoms, basically a mismatch between the organisation and what it can do and what the environment is asking it to do. Yeah, so the organisation, in strategic terms, the organisation loses its fit with its environment, which is fatal if it's allowed to go on. And the fatalities, quite brutal and stark. So S&P 500 is the top 500 companies in the US, which is the biggest economy in the world. So these are the biggest and best companies in the biggest and most successful economy in the world, and 85% have gone out of business in 40 years. Only one of the original S&P 500 is still in the S&P 500, and 14% still exist but are not in the S&P 500 anymore, and the other 85% are dead. Yeah. So the survival rate of even the biggest, most successful companies is horrendous, really. And overwhelmingly it's because of that problem that the world shifts and they do not shift fast enough. They lose their strategic fit with the environment and they die as a consequence. 35% of fatal strategic risks came from a direction they weren't even looking. So you kind of got to be looking where the lions are, not where they're not. Yeah. And overwhelmingly organisations don't. So in VSM, decision making is about getting balance. So balancing the needs of now versus the needs of the future, balancing. Hi John. And the fourth speaker has arrived. Well, actually the first speaker. Yeah. No, I wasn't panning at all, Russell. Yeah. So balancing the needs of the future versus the needs of now, and balancing the needs of the organisation internally against the needs of the external environment. And the role of governance, System 5, is partly around ensuring that balance is maintained, which is a kind of difficult trick to pull off, because the people who are good at the red stuff about ensuring delivery, System 3, tend not to be desperately good at doing System 4, looking outside and into the future, because the mindset tends to be very different, the time horizons are very different, the ability to use data is very different. I mean, I know there's a load of work being done on big data, predictive analytics, but that kind of doesn't deal with the lion problem. Yeah, it's not that sort of stuff that brings companies crashing down, and you need to think about the big challenges in terms of shift in a completely different way. Big data, predictive analytics would not have told Ford that Tesla was going to overtake them in cap value, because at the time when they needed to be thinking about that, Tesla were nowhere, you know, and within a very, very short space of time, they've gone straight past them. So in VSM, this is about building a conversational space in which those sorts of decision-making conversations can happen. And we tend in conventional management to try and string that out into a straight line and build a straight line process and go, we talk about this, then this, then this, then this, and turn it into a planning exercise. And from a VSM point of view, that really, really doesn't make sense. You cannot know in advance of running the decision-making process what sequence you're going to need to take things into account. So the art of this is about building a conversational space in which those conversations can happen naturally between different aspects of the organisation. Yeah, this is actually a very, very natural social process. So if you build a place in which this can happen, it happens very, very easily and naturally. But as I say, in conventional management thinking, we tend to sort of strip it out and straight line it at our peril. So that's VSM. The trick really is that it is fractal or recursive in nature, so exactly the same rule set around what you need to be viable is true for the organisation, it's true for a division within the organisation, true for a department within a division, true for a team within a department, true for a project within a team, and so on and so forth. It's true for the job I was working on last week, which was a whole economic sector, and you know, how do you actually going to structure that so it makes sense? And the lovely thing about it, apart from the fact that it allows you to do that really, really fast and with serious precision, is the scalability of it. So if you can design a project or a team, you can design anything. You can design a corporation. The rule set's exactly the same. The thinking is exactly the same. The content is different, and that's all. So that's VSM.